Hello again, everyone. This lecture will cover developments related to the final week of our course, that being memory in the immediate post-Soviet timeframe up until the present with Putin's Russia. In this lecture, we will examine Russia's attempts to reappropriate the war cult of the Soviet era and how this has elicited backlash. To begin with, we must define what this new form of the war cult entails. Indeed, this new invented tradition borrows from the Soviet version, but also distances itself in other aspects. The ultimate victory has now been attributed to the Russian people, first and foremost. They won the war in spite of the party. The crimes committed by the state have been described as brutal, but also necessary to survive the conflict, and not being particularly unique when compared to other nations and their actions, such as the Americans with the atomic bombs, and of course Germany with the Holocaust. The idea that the Red Army saved Europe from fascism more than the Western Allies did is just as old as memory of the war in Russia, and still finds life in modernity with this reformed version of the war cult. There's also a sort of haughty perception that Eastern Europe should be grateful for what the Red Army did back then. So the war cult has clearly been given a new nationalist makeover as the Russian people and state and traditions have become the center of its orbit. One question that must be asked, though, is this: what are the consequences of such a narrative for international relations? How does this narrative coexist with post Soviet republics in their attempts to forge their own traditions and national identities decades after independence? Um, it can clearly be seen that this reinvention of the war cult has not existed harmoniously with these nations as they craft their own narratives of being victims of Soviet crimes in ways that anger Moscow. So let's start with the Baltics. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania do not share the idea that Red Army soldiers were liberators. Instead, they have established museums of occupation to remember their Soviet eras as brutal conquests. They have all signed the Vilnius Declaration, which blames the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as being one of the instigators of the war, and they have and also establishing the thought that Stalinism was on the same level as Nazism. So clearly, they do not think of themselves as being saved. Rather, they think of themselves as being brutalized from both sides. Um, However, they have gone even further by banning Soviet symbolism, and some of these nations have even erected monuments honoring local Waffen SS volunteers. The latter, in particular, has incensed Russian officials as they have protested this bitterly on diplomatic grounds. Now let's move on to Ukraine, a state which is still attempting to forge a national identity, as this is really the first time that it has ever been truly been independent and recognized by the world at large. So, in a similar vein to the Baltics, there has been an increasing popularity of a particular figure named Stefan Bandera and his organization known as the OUNB. This man and his group did collaborate with the Nazis during the war, but this has not stopped him from being viewed more positively than Stalin. This follows along with the historical precedent of Ukrainians initially welcoming outside invaders in 1918 and 1941. In addition, the Holodomor has been declared a genocide in a move that is clearly a part of a new national tradition that casts Russians as the primary villains of their more modern history. They've also borrowed from the Polish an idea of an institute of national memory that also explores themes of Ukrainian nationhood being victimized by the Russians. To bring up more recent events, the Donbass War and the Crimean annexation have only served to exacerbate long standing tensions between Russians and Ukrainians, and will surely also inflame the national discourse against the Russian perception of World War II, the narrative that it was the Russians who bore the brunt of the fighting and also were the primary liberators. So in both Ukraine and the Baltics, the pro-Russian narrative of unity has instead of bridging gaps, brushed up against developing national narratives that contend that they have been victims of of Russia, dating back even to the czars, and this has led to conflicts of remembrance that will surely last well into the future. A question must also be asked as to whether a narrative of unity such as this can bring every element of society at large together. To that, it must be said that even the narrative of World War II in America cannot cover all groups easily, such as African Americans and Japanese Americans, and it is much the same in Putin's Russia, despite his best efforts. His attempts to put the Russian people at the forefront in the noble effort of the Red Army has drawn fire and criticism and also competing narratives from many elements in Russian society. To begin with, you have the monarchists who, aside from agitating for a return of the czars, have insisted on a rehabilitation of General Vlasov and his collaborationist forces. Clearly, they see Vlasov's cause and actions as being nobler than the Red Army's, and this undermines Putin's idea of national unity and faith in said cause. Um, the Communist Party, which still exists in large numbers, has repeatedly protested the diminishing of the old party's role. They still want the credit to belong to Stalin and the party apparatus. On the very opposite end of the spectrum, you have neo Nazis who march to promote the virtues of the very same enemy that Russia fought a death struggle against. Now, they may not have large enough numbers, but they do have enough to formulate marches that can grab attention. And so this also causes problems for Putin's unity, especially on the right. Putinites, for their part, strike back against those who criticize their leaders' policies and laws regarding memory. They have labeled those who criticize the Immortal Regiment marches, where people go in parades with pictures of their deceased or missing loved ones, as hereditary traitors. In addition, those who have spoken out against the prevailing narrative, as well as the laws criminalizing criticism or lying about Soviet activities during the war, have been labeled as fascists. As can be seen, the effort to use this new tradition to promote unity has not completely succeeded, even within Russia itself.